Another important view is that of the Sufis. Whereas we have previously emphasized institutional authority, the political position of the caliph and the role of the ulama, the learned class, and the sharia, the religious law, now let's shift from this institutional vantage point, which guided the faithful in Muslim society, to the Sufis, who emphasized a profoundly personal connection to the divine, requiring an examination of all that kept one separated from God, purging that in order to recover the true self and draw closer to God. Theirs was an alternate approach than that established by the ulama and their standards for proper practices and behavior in the Ummah. The Sufi way aimed at an intimacy with the divine. They looked for inspiration specifically on the Quran, viewing its surahs as having a transparent, visible outer meaning available to everyone, and an inner hidden meaning which provided even deeper insight, to which the Sufis looked and taught. And they looked to the example of the Prophet Muhammad, whom they saw as the first in the Sufi tradition. And they looked to early Muslim figures, particularly Ali, for inspiration and example. In the Quran, they can easily point to passages that express the closeness of the divine to the believer, that Allah, or God, is so near to every human being that he is even closer than the jugular vein. Or whether you hide what is in your heart or you manifest it, Allah, or God, knows it. To the Sufis, Muhammad was himself a mystic, through whom the message of God passed to the world, and whose life was an exemplary model of intimacy with the divine. From the Quran, Sufis drew on the Isra, Muhammad's mystical night journey from the Kaaba in Mecca to Jerusalem, to the spot where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located on the Temple Mount today. And then Muhammad mystically ascended to heaven. This is known as the Miraj, meaning ladder. And the spot from which he ascended is marked by the Dome of the Rock, which commemorates this mystical experience. During this mystical journey, Muhammad encountered the prophets of old, like Abraham and Moses and Jesus, and he was taken to a holy tree, a sidr tree or a lot tree, marking the highest level of heaven. And we can again reflect on environmental connections to religious ideas. Well, he passed this tree, and that's the boundary between the divine and that last section of heaven, with no angel, no person could pass. But Muhammad was granted access and interacted with the divine as speaking to a friend. Here was a mystical model for the Sufi way. To achieve such encounter required examining oneself, rooting out sin, renouncing attachment to the world, embracing humility and living in gratitude, and having complete trust in and reliance upon God. This would make possible a life of joy and pure love. This required controlling one's bodily desires and striving for the annihilation of self, in which one's true identity emerges as one draws closer to the divine, with contemplation of the divine presence and recitation of the divine name, that is dhikr, ever on one's lips to purify the heart and set the self in order. These are foundations of Sufi meditative and spiritual practices to free the spiritual self from the bodily desires, uncovering the truth of the heart. And here we may see elements reminiscent of some Buddhist and Hindu traditions. And I should also note that the term Sufi came from the wool robes that early Sufis wore, as suf is the Arabic term for wool. Among the early Sufis, there was Rabia al-Adawiyya, a female spiritual leader in the 8th century. In the stories about her, we see her in dialogue with the divine on intimate, close terms, while maintaining complete trust in the divine and acceptance of the divine will, with nothing at all mattering but one's love for God. "O Lord," she said, "whatever share of this world you have allotted to me, bestow it on your enemies. And whatever share of the next world you have allotted to me, bestow it on your friends. You are enough for me. And, O Lord, if I worship you in fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, withhold not your everlasting beauty." By teaching and living out a spiritual meaning that lay beneath the transparent message, Sufis often ran afoul of the ulama and the political authorities, because their teachings and practices were at odds with those commonly accepted views. In the late 9th and early 10th century, for example, Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj sought to improve society while pursuing the highest spiritual ideals. But his pronouncements were viewed as profoundly heretical. For example, "I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is I. We are two spirits dwelling in one body. If you see me, you see him, and if you see him, you see us both." In this case, the him is God, and Hallaj is describing an ecstatic experience of union with the divine. He stated, "Love is that you remain standing in front of your beloved. When you are deprived of all your attributes, then his attributes become your qualities." These were dangerous if misunderstood. And when he made ecstatic utterances such as "I am truth" or "I am God," claiming authority greater than the caliphs and ulama, al-Hallaj was executed for blasphemy in 922. As we see, there was often tension between Sufi and other ways of approaching Islam. In the 11th century, a member of the learned class, a Sunni professor in Baghdad named al-Ghazali, left his distinguished university career to live as a Sufi for a decade, and then returned to his academic career. Al-Ghazali wrote extensively and tried to reconcile the experience of Sufi Islam with mainstream Sunni Islam. Sufis employed different practices, which led to the development of Sufi communities or paths for achieving the same spiritual goals. And the founders of Sufi communities and Sufi leaders wrote poetry and treatises on Sufi practices. And these Sufis were often perceived as having great spiritual power and were held up as saints whose power was a blessing to others, and some even claimed helped to hold the world together as they served as intercessors with the divine. And a veneration of Sufi saints emerged with shrines dedicated to their memory. Let me conclude with one of these great Sufi masters, Jalaluddin Rumi, who lived in the 13th century. He was the founder of the Mevlevi order, in whose sema, or service, practitioners spin and move in unison in order to lose a sense of self and experience a transcendent state of mind and spirit. Rumi taught that the goal of the Sufi is to allow the soul to become like a reed flute, with the Spirit of God animating it, making one's life flow with the music of the divine. The poetry of Rumi, expressing such sentiments, is among the treasured collections of Islam, as Rumi beckons to us all. Come, Come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, it doesn't matter. Ours is a caravan of joy. Even if you've broken your vows 100 times, come, come, yet again, come.